Here's a guy trying to convince us that a conclusive argument against God's existence is actually the best argument for God's existence.
Of all the different arguments for the existence of God, only one gets mentioned again and again by modern atheists as being a powerful proof for God's existence.
I guess I'm not on the list because I'm a postmodern atheist.
And I won't leave you in suspense any longer. That argument is the fine-tuning argument for God's existence.
I agree that the fine-tuning argument is a great argument, but it's actually a great argument against God's existence. The argument is that if the parameters of the universe were even slightly different, the development and survival of life would be impossible. Since the range of values for said parameters that would permit life are so tiny, it is very improbable that they are what they are by chance. Therefore, something must have made them what they are, and theists of course infer that this something is God. The problem is that if an all-powerful God exists, it isn't true that life is impossible in a universe with different constants. Because an all-powerful God would have the power to put life into a universe with any set of constants.
And it goes like this. According to the fine-tuning argument, the odds the universe's laws of physics would be life permitting are almost zero. They're like the odds of winning 10 games of poker in a row, all with royal flushes.
This assumes that the parameters of the universe were ever free to vary, which we have no reason to believe is the case. Even if they were ever free to vary, the probabilities apologists cite would only be correct if we assume that the values we can imagine the parameters of the universe having are all equally probable. The mere fact that we can imagine these values being different doesn't mean that they ever actually could have been different. There was never a time when they were different, and there is no known mechanism which can change them, so the idea of them being different seems far more absurd to me than the fact that they are what they are.
If you suspect design in the case of that winning streak, then you should suspect a similar design in the far more improbable laws that govern our universe.
Well, that would require me to infer the existence of a designer that exists independent of time and space, which is not even improbable. It's an outright contradiction. To exist is to have location in space-time. Therefore, an entity that exists independent of space-time is an oxymoron.
But first, let's take a look at what atheists say about the fine-tuning argument and why so many people find it compelling. And then I'll address a relatively new objection to the argument that I haven't covered before in previous episodes. First, here's Richard Dawkins.
When you come on later to the origin of the physical constants, now that's getting warm, that's getting close to a good argument.
And here's the late atheist Christopher Hitchens.
Essentially, it says, why are conditions so optimal for life in this terrestrial orb? Fine-tuning. And I was surprised to find that Richard was impressed by that too. I mean, we know what the arguments against it are, and I can tell them to you if you like, and I consider them to be pretty conclusive arguments, but there is something that has to impress you. I mean, the likelihood that there could be nothing is so strong, but not to be impressed by the fact that we are here rather than not is to be, well, too easily unimpressed.
At some point, certainly, we're all asked, well, which is the best argument you've yet come up against from the other side? And I think every one of us picks the fine-tuning one as the most intriguing.
The Goldilocks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here's Rationality Rules admitting that many people find the argument persuasive.
Overall, based exclusively on my own conviction, I've placed fine-tuning arguments in either B or C tier. But since so many others find them persuasive, especially intuitively persuasive, I'm happy to bump them to A tier. They are, I freely admit, compelling arguments.
An atheist YouTuber named Genetically Modified Skeptic says,
Finally, we're up to S tier, where only the most effective arguments belong. At this tier, I'm going to place the teleological argument, specifically the argument from fine-tuning. Given its high intuitiveness, its ability to turn its fallacy into a cheap victory to some, its incredible communicability, and its refutation-resisting ability of turning any challenge into an attack on its user's existential security, the teleological argument belongs in S tier.
Alex O'Connor and Joe Schmidt rank the fine-tuning argument as an A, or top-level argument, because the alternative explanations for the universe's fine-tuning often don't seem very plausible.
It just seems a bit less plausible.
I mean, it tells us something's, I don't know, something's up, something's going on, something strange about our universe, maybe.
Something about the universe is in a way that it could very easily have not been,
at least epistemic.
That seems difficult to explain.
Yeah.
Then, okay, sure, you know what? Fine.
A tier it is.
Shake on it. A tier.
A tier it is.
Fine-tuning argument for the existence of God. Tier A.
Given that the first premise of the argument, that life would be impossible in a universe with even slightly different parameters, can only be true if the conclusion, that a God exists, is false, the fine-tuning argument seems to me to be one of the least intuitive. To say that life would be impossible in a universe with even slightly different constants denotes that there is not, in fact, any entity with the power to put life into such a universe. To accept the central premise of the argument is to accept that there is no God. The idea that an all-powerful being has to fiddle around with the settings of the universe to get life to exist in it seems so immediately absurd to me that I have to ask my fellow atheist what brand of glue you have to sniff to find this argument persuasive, because Elmer's isn't doing it for me.
Finally, the philosopher Philip Goff was once an atheist, but the fine-tuning of the laws of nature in the universe was one of the pieces of evidence that led him to believe in panpsychism instead of atheism, or the view that consciousness is a fundamental part of reality.
Panpsychism has never made sense to me because consciousness is not even a fundamental part of the brain, let alone the entire universe. How can the whole universe be fundamentally conscious if not even the brain is always conscious?
And from there, he eventually came to accept a very liberal form of Christianity that, in part, denies God's omnipotence because of the problem of evil. However, the fine-tuning of the universe is something that kept Goff from fully embracing an atheistic, purposeless universe, as he describes in his 2023 book, Why: The Purpose of the Universe.
I would actually find the fine-tuning argument to be much less absurd if God were not defined as being all-powerful, because then the premise that says that life is impossible without very specific parameters would not necessarily contradict the existence of such a God. It still wouldn't convince me, however, because God would still have to be defined as having location in space-time rather than existing independent of space-time in order for me to find the concept coherent.
I think many people consider the fine-tuning argument persuasive because when people seek evidence for the existence of God, they want something that seems like it cannot have any natural explanation.
Which is not the case for the fine-tuning argument. Since the constants have never not been what they are, which is why they're called constants, there was never a time when they could have ended up being anything but what they are. Since they've never been different, and there is no known mechanism that can change them, that seems like it's as thorough an explanation as any phenomenon could possibly have.
In his paper, Divine Fine-Tuning versus Electrons in Love, Neil Sinababu reframes the fine-tuning argument and says that it's not life forms like you and I that motivate the fine-tuning argument, but the existence of conscious embodied agents, regardless of what they're made out of, whether they're fleshy creatures like us or some other kind of life form. He says that the probability of a universe having these kinds of conscious agents may not be that low.
Well, if a God exists, that God is himself a conscious agent, although he's only occasionally embodied. Allegedly, the existence of such an entity is not contingent upon the existence of any universe at all, let alone a finely tuned one. This is another reason why, if there's a God, the claim that life is impossible without a finely tuned universe is clearly false. Also, some apologists will make the argument that God had to create life because life only ever comes from other life, which implies that God is himself a life form. To say that life is impossible without a universe that has very finely tuned parameters is therefore to say that there is no God. The fine-tuning argument is definitely an S-tier argument, but it's an S-tier argument against God's existence.
Because if so-called psychophysical laws of the universe were different, then even universes that only have hydrogen atoms, because they have different constants in the laws of physics, even if it only had hydrogen atoms, it might still have conscious agents if there were different psychophysical laws that govern how consciousness comes to be.
Well, again, you believe that God is conscious and doesn't need any physical laws in order to exist. In fact, you believe that we have souls which are non-physical supernatural entities, which also presumably don't need physical laws in order to be conscious.
He writes, under more mind-friendly psychophysical laws, protons and electrons themselves could have minds like ours. These laws could dictate that these particles have sensory experiences of all the forces other particles exert on them, with the forces most strongly affecting them giving rise to the psychology of belief and then intentional action. Protons and electrons could yearn to be together, feeling delight at the presence of the other as their opposite charges drew them closer. When they formed a hydrogen atom, they could fall in love.
That sounds rather far-fetched to me, but less so than the idea that consciousness can exist without being part of any physical system at all.
Now, one response is to say that this is just impossible. Just because you can form an image of something in your mind, that doesn't mean the image you form could really happen or that it's metaphysically possible.
You mean like the image of a universe with different constants? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.